The helicopter blades cut through the thin mountain air as Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison checked his gear one last time. Below them, the snow-covered peaks of the Hindu Kush Mountains stretched endlessly in every direction. The mission was supposed to be simple: locate and extract a captured intelligence officer before enemy forces could move him across the border. 2 minutes out, the pilot shouted over the roar of the engines. Morrison looked at his team. There was Corporal Danny Reeves, the youngest member at 22, whose steady hands could disarm any explosive device. Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos handled communications, his thick accent barely noticeable when he spoke into his radio. The medic, Petty Officer Lisa Chun, was busy organizing her medical supplies. Finally, there was Chief Petty Officer Marcus Williams, their sniper, carefully checking his rifle scope. The intelligence briefing had been clear. Agent Thompson was being held in a small compound about 12 miles from their insertion point. The enemy had roughly 30 fighters, mostly local militia with basic weapons. The weather forecast showed clear skies for the next 48 hours. Everything seemed routine. 30 seconds, came the pilot's voice again. Morrison felt the familiar knot in his stomach that came before every mission. He had done this hundreds of times, but something felt different today. Maybe it was the complete silence on the radio frequencies they had been monitoring. Usually, enemy communications chattered constantly in these mountains, but today there was nothing. The helicopter touched down with a soft thud in a small clearing surrounded by pine trees. Snow immediately swirled around them as the team quickly unloaded their gear. Within 60 seconds, they were on the ground with their packs, and the helicopter was disappearing over the ridge. The silence that followed was almost complete, just the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant sound of their own breathing. Morrison pulled out his GPS device and confirmed their location. They were exactly where they needed to be. "All right, team," Morrison said quietly, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "We move in formation. Santos, I want constant communication checks every 15 minutes. Chun, stay close to the middle. Williams, take point with your scope. Reeves, watch our 6. They began moving through the deep snow, each step requiring extra effort in the thin mountain air. The terrain was more difficult than the satellite images had suggested. What looked like gentle slopes from above were actually steep climbs over loose rock hidden beneath the snow. After 2 hours of hiking, they reached their first checkpoint, a small ridge that overlooked the valley where the compound was located. Williams crawled forward with his rifle and scanned the area through his scope. "I see the compound," he whispered. "Looks quiet. Maybe too quiet." Morrison moved up beside him and pulled out his binoculars. The compound was exactly as described in their briefing, a main building surrounded by a low stone wall, with what appeared to be guard towers at each corner. But Williams was right. There was no movement anywhere. "Could be they're all inside because of the cold," Chin suggested. "Or it's a trap," Reeves added, checking his weapon nervously. Santos tried to raise their command base on the radio, but got only static. "Communication is sketchy up here, Sergeant. These mountains are blocking everything." Morrison studied the compound again. Their orders were clear: get in, find Thompson, and get out. The longer they waited, the more likely enemy reinforcements would arrive. "We stick to the plan," Morrison decided. "We'll approach from the north side where the wall is lowest. Williams, you find a good overwatch position and cover us. If anything goes wrong, you provide sniper support while we extract." The team spent another hour moving into position. The compound remained eerily quiet as they approached. Williams found a good spot on a small hill about 400 yards away, hidden behind some large rocks. The rest of the team moved to within 50 yards of the north wall. Morrison was about to give the signal to move when Santos grabbed his arm. "Sergeant, I'm picking up movement on the radio. Sounds like multiple groups moving in our direction." "How many?" Morrison asked. "Hard to tell. The signal keeps cutting in and out. Could be 20, could be 50. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. This was not part of the plan. He looked at the compound again. Still no movement, but now he noticed something else. There were no footprints in the snow around the building. If people were living there, there should be signs of daily activity. "This whole thing stinks," he muttered. Suddenly, Chin pointed toward the eastern ridge. "Movement up there." Through his binoculars, Morrison could see figures moving along the ridgeline. They were being flanked. He counted at least 15 enemy fighters, and they were moving with purpose, not randomly patrolling. "Williams, do you copy?" Morrison whispered into his radio. "I see them," came the reply. "We've got more coming from the west, too. Looks like they knew we were coming." Morrison's mind raced. The mission was compromised, but they still had no idea where Thompson was being held. If they retreated now, the captured agent would likely be moved or killed. "Options?" he asked his team. "We could try to reach the compound before they surround us," Reeves suggested. "Or we could find a defensive position and call for extraction," Santos added. Morrison looked at the sky. Clouds were beginning to form over the peaks, moving faster than the weather forecast had predicted. If a storm hit, helicopter extraction would be impossible. "The compound is our best bet," Morrison decided. "At least there will have walls and shelter. We find Thompson and hold until extraction is possible." The team moved quickly toward the compound wall. Behind them, they could hear the enemy forces getting closer. Shouts echoed across the valley in a language none of them understood, but the meaning was clear. The net was closing. They reached the wall just as the first snowflakes began to fall. What had started as a simple extraction mission was about to become something much more dangerous. Morrison boosted Reeves over the compound wall first. The young corporal landed softly in the snow and immediately took a defensive position, scanning the area with his rifle ready. One by one, the rest of the team followed. The compound was even more unsettling up close. The main building showed signs of recent activity, but it felt abandoned. There were cooking pots outside one of the smaller buildings, still containing frozen food that looked like it had been left in a hurry. Footprints led from the main building toward the back of the compound, but they disappeared at a rocky area where the snow couldn't stick. "This feels like a setup," Chen whispered, her medical bag ready in case they encountered Thompson injured. Santos tried the radio again. Still nothing from command. "The storm is getting worse." Looking up, Morrison could see that the snow was falling heavier now. What had started as scattered flakes was becoming a steady snowfall. The wind was also picking up, causing the snow to swirl in small tornadoes around the compound buildings. "We need to clear these buildings fast," Morrison said. "Santos, you and Chun take the small buildings on the left. Reeves and I will take the main building. Everyone stays in visual contact." Through his earpiece, Morrison could hear Williams reporting from his overwatch position. "I count at least 40 enemy fighters now. They're surrounding the compound, but they're not approaching. It's like they're waiting for something." Morrison felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. If the enemy wasn't attacking, it meant they had a plan. Maybe they were waiting for reinforcements, or maybe they knew something the SEAL team didn't. The main building had a heavy wooden door that was slightly open. Morrison and Reeves approached carefully, using hand signals to coordinate their entry. Morrison went in first, his rifle ready, while Reeves covered the door. Inside, the building was dark and cold. There were signs that people had been living here recently. Sleeping bags were rolled up in one corner. A small fire pit in the center of the room still had warm ashes. Most importantly, there were chains attached to one wall that looked like they had been used to hold a prisoner. "Thompson was here," Morrison whispered. "But not anymore." Reeves found something interesting in the corner. "Sergeant, look at this." He held up a small piece of cloth torn from what looked like an American uniform. There was also a small blood stain on the wall near the chains. Morrison's radio crackled. "Sergeant, we found something over here," Santos reported. "There's a tunnel entrance in one of the small buildings. Looks like it goes under the compound." Morrison and Reeves quickly moved to where Santos and Chun were waiting. Sure enough, behind a false wall in one of the storage buildings was a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. "This is how they moved Thompson," Chun said. "And probably how they knew we were coming. They could have spotters anywhere in these mountains using this tunnel system." The tunnel was just wide enough for one person to crawl through. Morrison shined his flashlight into it, but couldn't see where it ended. The walls were roughly cut through rock and dirt, reinforced with wooden beams. It looked like it had taken months to dig. "Williams, any change in the enemy positions?" Morrison asked over his radio. "Negative. They're still holding their positions around the compound. But, Sergeant, you need to know something. The storm is getting really bad up here. Visibility is dropping fast." Morrison looked outside and saw that Williams was right. The snow was now falling so heavily that they could barely see the compound walls. The wind had picked up significantly, creating a howling sound that would mask any noise the enemy made approaching. "We need to make a decision," Morrison told his team. "We can try to follow this tunnel and hope it leads to Thompson, or we can try to break out of here and find another way. If we go into that tunnel, we'll be trapped if the enemy follows us," Reeves pointed out. "And if we stay here, we're definitely trapped," Santos added. "At least the tunnel gives us a chance to find Thompson." Chen was examining the tunnel entrance more closely. "Look at this," she said, pointing to some markings on the wall. "These scratches look fresh. Someone was recently dragged through here." Morrison made his decision. "Santos, you stay here and monitor the radio. If you hear anything from Command or Williams, let us know immediately. Chun, Reeves, and I are going into the tunnel." "Sergeant, I should stay with Santos," Chen argued. "If you find Thompson injured, you'll need me with you." "She's right," Morrison agreed. "Santos, can you handle the radio and watch our exit alone?" "No problem, Sergeant. Just don't take too long. This storm is only getting worse." Morrison, Chun, and Reeves entered the tunnel. It was even more cramped than it looked from the entrance. They had to crawl on their hands and knees, pushing their equipment ahead of them. The tunnel sloped downward, taking them deeper underground. After about 50 yards, the tunnel branched off in two directions. Morrison stopped to examine both passages. One continued straight ahead, sloping further downward. The other curved to the right and seemed to go upward. "Which way?" Chen whispered. Morrison looked for clues. In the dirt on the floor of the right-hand tunnel, he could see drag marks and what looked like drops of blood. "This way," he said, heading right. The tunnel curved several times, and Morrison began to worry that they were getting too far from the compound. If they needed to retreat quickly, it would be a long crawl back. But then he heard something that made him freeze. Voices speaking in English. "Did you hear that?" Chen whispered. They all listened carefully. Faintly, through the rock walls, they could hear someone speaking American English. The voice was weak and sounded injured, but it was definitely Thompson. Morrison moved forward more quickly now. The tunnel opened into a small underground chamber that had been carved out of the rock. There were battery-powered lanterns providing light, and in the far corner, chained to the wall, was Agent Thompson. The intelligence officer looked up as they entered. His face was bruised, and he had a bandage around his left arm, but he was conscious and alert. "Thank God," Thompson whispered. "I thought you weren't coming." But as Chin moved forward to examine Thompson's injuries, Morrison noticed something that made his blood freeze. The chamber had another entrance on the far side, and through it, he could hear voices speaking in the local language. They were getting closer. Morrison held up his hand for silence as the voices grew louder. Through the far entrance, he could see flashlight beams dancing on the walls. The enemy was coming, and they had maybe 2 minutes before being discovered. Chin quickly examined Thompson's chains while Reeves covered the entrance they had come from. "These locks are old but strong," she whispered. "I need something to cut them." Reeves pulled out a small explosive charge from his pack. "This will work, but it'll be loud." "Do it," Morrison decided. "We're out of time." The small explosion echoed through the underground chamber like thunder. Thompson's chains fell away, but the noise had definitely given away their position. Shouts erupted from the far tunnel, and Morrison could hear running footsteps approaching fast. "Can you walk?" Chin asked Thompson as she helped him to his feet. "I think so," Thompson replied weakly. "They didn't break anything, but I haven't eaten much in 3 days." Morrison's radio crackled with Santos's voice. "Sergeant, the compound is under attack. Multiple enemy forces are moving in from all sides. Williams is providing covering fire, but there are too many of them." "We're coming out with Thompson," Morrison replied. "Hold your position." But as they reached the tunnel entrance they had come from, Morrison heard something that made his heart sink. More voices, coming from their escape route. The enemy had followed them into the tunnels. "We're trapped," Reeves said quietly. Morrison looked around the chamber. There was their entrance, the enemy's entrance, and what looked like a third tunnel entrance that was partially blocked by fallen rocks. "What's through there?" he asked Thompson, pointing to the blocked entrance. "I don't know," Thompson replied. "They blindfolded me when they brought me down here. But I heard water dripping from that direction. Maybe an underground stream." Morrison made a quick decision. Reeves, help me clear these rocks. Chun, check Thompson for any injuries that might slow us down. They worked frantically to clear the rock pile while listening to the approaching enemy voices. Morrison could hear at least 6 different voices from the far tunnel, and they were getting closer. From their escape route, he could hear more voices coming down from the compound. Sergeant, came Williams's voice over the radio, barely audible through static. I can't see the compound anymore. This blizzard is getting worse. I'm going to try to get to a better position. Morrison's heart sank further. Without Williams providing sniper support, they would have no cover when they tried to escape. Finally, they cleared enough rocks to squeeze through the 3rd tunnel. Morrison went first, followed by Thompson, then Chun, with Reeves bringing up the rear. This tunnel was different from the others. It was natural, carved by water over thousands of years, and it sloped steeply downward. Behind them, they heard shouts as the enemy forces discovered the empty chamber. Flashlight beams swept through the space they had just left. The tunnel curved sharply to the left and opened into a larger cave. Morrison could hear running water somewhere in the darkness. His flashlight revealed an underground stream that disappeared into a hole in the cave floor. Dead end, Reeves said. But Thompson pointed to something Morrison had missed. There, on the far wall, another passage. Sure enough, there was a narrow opening about 6 feet up the cave wall. To reach it, they would have to climb over slippery rocks next to the underground stream. I'll go first and help pull Thompson up, Morrison said. Chun, you and Reeves boost him from below. Getting Thompson up to the passage was difficult. He was weak from his captivity and couldn't use his injured arm effectively. But they managed to get him up and through the opening just as they heard voices echoing through the tunnel behind them. This new passage was even narrower than the others. They had to crawl single file, and there was barely room for their equipment. Morrison began to worry that they were getting deeper underground when they should be trying to get back to the surface. After what felt like an hour of crawling, the passage finally began to slope upward. Morrison's flashlight showed natural rock walls that looked different from the tunnels they had been in before. This cave system was much older. Where do you think this leads? Chun asked. Hopefully somewhere the enemy doesn't know about, Morrison replied. They continued climbing through the passage until Morrison saw something that gave him hope, a faint light ahead. Not artificial light from flashlights or lanterns, but the gray light of day. The passage opened onto a narrow ledge on the side of a cliff. They were high up on the mountain, looking down into a valley Morrison didn't recognize. The snowstorm was raging around them, making it almost impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. Where are we? Reeves asked, looking around. Morrison pulled out his GPS device, but the display showed no signal. The storm was too heavy for the satellites to get through. We're somewhere on the mountain, he said. But I don't know exactly where. Thompson was shivering badly. His captors had taken his winter gear, and he was wearing only a thin shirt and pants. Chun immediately pulled out an emergency blanket and wrapped it around him. We need to find shelter, she said. He won't last long in this cold. Morrison looked around the cliff face. Above them, the rock wall rose straight up for what looked like hundreds of feet. Below them was a sheer drop into the valley. To their right, the ledge continued along the cliff face, but he couldn't see where it led through the storm. That way, he decided, pointing right. We follow the ledge and hope it leads to something. They moved carefully along the narrow ledge, staying close to the cliff wall. The wind was strong enough to push them toward the edge, and the snow made every step slippery. Thompson was having trouble keeping up, even with Chun helping him. After about 100 yards, the ledge widened, and they found what looked like the entrance to a cave. Morrison shined his flashlight inside and saw that it was shallow but deep enough to provide shelter from the storm. This will have to do, he said. They helped Thompson into the cave, and Chun began treating his injuries properly for the first time. His arm wound was infected, and he was showing signs of dehydration. Morrison tried his radio again. Nothing but static. The storm was completely blocking all communications. How long do you think this storm will last? Reeves asked. Morrison looked out at the swirling snow. Storms in these mountains could last for days, and helicopter rescue would be impossible until it cleared. I don't know, he admitted. But we can't stay here long. The enemy knows these mountains better than we do. They'll find us eventually. As if to prove his point, they heard something that made them all freeze. Voices, coming from somewhere below them on the mountain. The enemy was still hunting them, even in the storm. Morrison realized their situation was getting desperate. They were trapped on a cliff face in a blizzard, with an injured man who couldn't travel far, no communication with their support team, and enemy forces closing in on their position. The voices below them were getting closer. Morrison counted at least 8 different speakers, and they seemed to know exactly where they were going. Someone was tracking them through the cave system, probably following the same route they had taken to escape. "They're going to find us," Reeves whispered, checking his rifle. Morrison looked at their situation. Thompson could barely walk, let alone fight. Chin was a medic, not a frontline combatant. Reeves was skilled but young, and they were trapped on a narrow ledge with nowhere to run. "We make our stand here," Morrison decided. "Reeves, you cover the cave entrance. Chun, get Thompson as far back as possible and keep him down. I'll try to find Williams on the radio." Morrison moved to the edge of the ledge and tried his radio again. Through the heavy static, he thought he heard something. "Williams, do you copy?" he whispered into the radio. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, faintly, he heard Williams's voice. "Morrison, barely hear you. Where are you?" "We're on a cliff face, east side of the compound," Morrison replied, though he wasn't entirely sure of their direction. "We have Thompson, but we're pinned down. Enemy forces are climbing up toward us. Can't see, storm too heavy, trying to find you." The radio went silent again. Morrison wasn't even sure Williams had heard his location. Inside the cave, Chin was doing her best to treat Thompson's wounds with limited supplies. "His infection is getting worse," she reported quietly. "He needs real medical attention soon." Thompson looked up at Morrison. Despite his injuries and exhaustion, his eyes were alert. "Sergeant, there's something you need to know about why I was captured." "What?" Morrison asked, moving closer. "I wasn't just gathering intelligence," Thompson said weakly. "I had information about a major enemy operation, an attack on one of our bases that's supposed to happen tomorrow night." Morrison felt his stomach drop. "What kind of attack?" "Coordinated assault on forward operating base Delta. They have inside information about our defenses. If I don't get this intelligence back to command." Thompson trailed off, too weak to continue. Morrison understood. This wasn't just about rescuing one man anymore. Thompson had information that could save hundreds of American lives. They had to get him back, no matter what. The voices outside were much closer now. Morrison could hear them clearly, even through the storm. They were speaking in the local language, but the tone was excited. They had found the trail. "Contact front," Reeves called out quietly. Through the cave entrance, Morrison could see shapes moving through the snow. The enemy had reached their level and was approaching the cave. Morrison counted 6 figures, all armed with rifles. Morrison moved to the cave entrance and took position next to Reeves. Chun dragged Thompson to the very back of the cave and used her own body to shield him. "When I give the signal, we both fire," Morrison whispered to Reeves. "Aim for center mass. Don't worry about being quiet anymore." The enemy fighters were moving carefully along the ledge, obviously aware that their prey might be cornered and dangerous. They were about 50 yards away and closing. Morrison was about to give the signal to fire when something happened that changed everything. Through the howling wind and snow, he heard a sound that made his heart race, the distant crack of a rifle shot. One of the approaching enemy fighters suddenly spun and fell off the ledge. "Sniper!" one of the remaining enemies shouted in English. Another rifle shot echoed across the mountain, and a second enemy fighter dropped. The remaining 4 immediately took cover behind rocks on the ledge. Morrison's radio crackled. "Morrison, this is Williams. I found you. I'm on the peak across from you. But this storm is making it almost impossible to shoot." Morrison felt a surge of hope. Williams had somehow climbed to a position where he could provide sniper support, even though the visibility was almost zero. "Williams, we have 4 hostiles pinned down on our ledge, about 30 yards east of our position," Morrison reported. "I can barely see through this snow," Williams replied. "You need to mark their positions somehow." Morrison looked around the cave for anything they could use as a signal. Reeves had an idea. He pulled out a small flare from his emergency kit. "If I throw this out there, it might give Williams enough light to see the targets," Reeves suggested. Do it, Morrison said. Reeves pulled the pin and threw the flare out onto the ledge. It burst into bright red light, illuminating the area through the swirling snow. For a few seconds, Morrison could clearly see the 4 enemy fighters crouched behind rocks. 2 more rifle shots rang out in quick succession. Williams had taken down 2 more targets through the storm. The remaining 2 enemies realized they were being picked off by a sniper they couldn't see and began retreating along the ledge. But Morrison knew their problems weren't over. Williams, any movement below us? Affirmative, came the reply. I can see more figures climbing up toward your position. Looks like at least a dozen more hostiles. Morrison's heart sank. Even with Williams providing sniper support, they couldn't hold this position against a dozen enemies. The cave was too shallow to provide real protection, and they had limited ammunition. Options? Morrison asked his team. The ledge continues further along the cliff face, Reeves observed. Maybe we can move to a better position. Chen looked up from treating Thompson. He can't travel much further. He's getting weaker. Morrison studied the situation. Moving along the ledge would expose them to sniper fire from below, but staying here meant being overrun by superior numbers. Williams, can you see where the ledge goes? Morrison asked over the radio. Negative. Storm is too heavy. But, Morrison, there's something else. I can see lights in the valley below. Looks like vehicle headlights. Could be reinforcements coming for the enemy. Morrison felt the walls closing in around them. They were trapped on a cliff face, in a blizzard, with an injured man who couldn't travel, and now enemy reinforcements were arriving. Suddenly, Chen had an idea. Sergeant, what if we don't try to run? What if we make them think we're gone? What do you mean? Morrison asked. Chen pointed to the back of the cave. There's another crevice back there. It's narrow, but we might all fit. If we cover the entrance with rocks and snow, they might think the cave is empty. It was desperate, but it might work. Morrison looked at the crevice Chen was pointing to. It was barely wide enough for one person, but it went deep into the rock. It's worth a try, Morrison decided. Help me move these rocks. They quickly began piling rocks and snow at the front of the crevice, creating a makeshift wall that would hide them from anyone entering the cave. Thompson was so weak that Chun had to carry most of his weight as they squeezed into the narrow space. Just as they finished concealing their hiding spot, Morrison heard voices outside the cave again. The enemy reinforcements had arrived. Squeezed into the narrow crevice behind their makeshift rock wall, the 4 Americans held their breath as enemy voices filled the cave. Morrison could hear at least 6 different speakers, all talking rapidly in the local language. They were searching every inch of the cave. Through a small gap in the rocks, Morrison could see flashlight beams dancing across the cave walls. One beam stopped directly on their hiding spot, and Morrison was sure they had been discovered. But after a few tense seconds, the light moved on. They were here, he heard one voice say in accented English. Blood on the rocks. But where did they go? Another voice responded in the local language, sounding frustrated. Morrison wished Santos was with them to translate, but their communications specialist was still trapped back at the compound, assuming he was still alive. Thompson was struggling to stay quiet. His breathing was labored, and Morrison could feel him shaking from fever. Chen was doing her best to keep him calm while monitoring his condition in the cramped space. Through his earpiece, Morrison heard Williams's voice, barely audible. Morrison, I count 12 hostiles in your area. They're searching the entire cliff face. Morrison couldn't respond without giving away their position. He had to assume Williams understood their situation. The voices in the cave continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Finally, Morrison heard them moving back toward the cave entrance. But, instead of leaving, they seemed to be setting up a position there. They're going to wait for us, Reeves whispered so quietly Morrison could barely hear him. Morrison realized they were in an impossible situation. They couldn't stay hidden much longer. Thompson needed medical attention, and they would eventually run out of air in the cramped space. But they couldn't move without being seen by the enemy fighters positioned at the cave entrance. Suddenly, Morrison's radio crackled with a different voice. Blue Team, this is Eagle 1. Do you copy? Morrison's heart leaped. It was the voice of their helicopter pilot. But he couldn't respond without giving away their position. The radio continued. Blue Team, we have your signal from earlier. Weather is breaking slightly. We might have a window for extraction in 30 minutes. Morrison felt a surge of hope, followed immediately by despair. Even if the helicopter could reach them, they were trapped in a cave with enemy fighters blocking their exit. Through the gap in the rocks, Morrison saw one of the enemy fighters making a phone call. Although he couldn't understand the language, the tone suggested the fighter was calling for orders. After a brief conversation, the fighter hung up and spoke to his companions in an urgent voice. Morrison heard movement at the cave entrance and risked looking through the gap again. The enemy fighters were leaving the cave, but they were posting guards on the ledge outside. Williams, Morrison whispered as quietly as possible into his radio. They're moving to external positions. Can you see them? Barely, came the reply. Storm is still bad, but I can see some movement on your ledge. Morrison made a decision. They had to try to break out before the helicopter arrived. If the aircraft showed up while they were still trapped, it would just become another target. Chun, how is Thompson? Morrison asked quietly. Not good, she replied. His fever is rising, and he's becoming delirious. He won't be able to move quickly. Morrison looked at their situation. Thompson couldn't run. They were outnumbered. The weather was terrible, but they had one advantage. Williams was in position with his sniper rifle, and the enemy didn't know exactly where he was. Williams, I need you to create a distraction, Morrison whispered. In 60 seconds, start picking off the guards on the ledge. We're going to make a run for it. Copy that, Williams replied. But, Morrison, you need to know something. I'm running low on ammunition. After this, I won't have much left. Morrison felt his stomach tighten. They were getting down to their last options. Understood, Morrison replied. Make every shot count. Morrison turned to his team. When Williams starts shooting, we move fast. Reeves, you carry Thompson. Chun, stay between us. I'll take point and clear the path. They waited in tense silence. Morrison counted the seconds in his head. 58, 59, 60. The crack of Williams's rifle echoed across the mountain. Through the cave entrance, Morrison heard a shout of pain and the sound of someone falling. Another rifle shot. Another shout. Go, Morrison hissed. They burst out of their hiding spot and rushed toward the cave entrance. Morrison went first, his rifle ready. The ledge outside was chaos. 2 enemy fighters were down, and the others were scrambling for cover, trying to figure out where the sniper fire was coming from. Morrison shot one fighter who was directly in their path. Reeves followed, carrying Thompson over his shoulder. Chin stayed close behind them, her pistol drawn. They made it about 20 yards along the ledge when Morrison heard something that made his blood freeze. The sound of automatic weapons fire coming from multiple directions. The enemy had called in reinforcements, and they were now caught in a crossfire. We're trapped, Reeves yelled, taking cover behind a large boulder. They've got us surrounded. Morrison looked around desperately. Enemy fighters were positioned on the ledge both ahead and behind them. Others were firing from positions higher up on the cliff face. There was nowhere to run. Williams, we need help. Morrison shouted into his radio. I see you, Williams replied, his voice strained. But I can't get a clear shot through this storm. The wind is too strong, and I can barely see your position. Morrison realized they were about to be overrun. He had maybe 30 seconds before the enemy fighters would move in for the kill. Then, something happened that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. The snowstorm, which had been raging for hours, suddenly intensified beyond anything they had experienced. The wind became so strong that it was difficult to stand. The snow fell so heavily that visibility dropped to almost zero. But, instead of making their situation worse, the storm created an opportunity. Williams, Morrison called into his radio. Can you see the muzzle flashes from the enemy positions? Affirmative, Williams replied. Even through the storm, I can see their weapons firing. That's your target reference, Morrison said. Forget trying to see the targets. Just aim for the muzzle flashes. What happened next was a demonstration of why Navy SEALs are considered among the world's best soldiers. Through the blinding snowstorm, from a position over 800 yards away, with wind gusting over 50 miles per hour, Williams began taking perfect shots based only on the brief flashes of light from enemy weapons. The first shot silenced a machine gun position above them. The second took out a sniper who had been targeting Morrison's team. The third and fourth shots eliminated fighters on the ledge ahead of them. Each shot was perfectly placed, Despite the impossible conditions, Williams was shooting based on training, instinct, and experience that few people in the world possessed. Path is clear ahead, Williams reported. Move now before they reposition. Morrison and his team ran along the ledge as Williams continued providing cover fire through the storm. Behind them, they could hear enemy fighters shouting in confusion, unable to figure out where the deadly accurate fire was coming from. After running for what felt like forever, they reached a wider section of the ledge where Morrison could see a helicopter landing zone marked with strobing lights. Through the storm, he could hear the distant sound of rotors approaching. Eagle 1, this is Morrison. We're at the extraction point with the package, Morrison called into his radio. Copy that, Blue Team. Coming in hot. Be ready to move fast. The helicopter appeared through the storm like a ghost, barely visible until it was almost on top of them. The pilot was flying purely on instruments and radio guidance, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction. As they loaded Thompson into the helicopter, Morrison heard Williams's voice one last time. Morrison, this is Williams. I'm out of ammunition and the enemy has spotted my position. I'm moving to alternate extraction point Alpha. Morrison felt a stab of fear for his teammate, but there was nothing he could do. The helicopter was already lifting off, and they had to get Thompson to medical attention. As they flew through the storm towards safety, Morrison looked back at the mountain where Williams was still fighting for his life. The sniper had saved them all with the most remarkable display of marksmanship Morrison had ever witnessed. 3 days later, Williams made it to the alternate extraction point, having evaded enemy forces through 40 miles of mountain terrain in a blizzard. Thompson's intelligence prevented the attack on forward operating base Delta, saving the lives of 200 American soldiers. But Morrison would never forget those moments on the ledge when Williams, shooting through a snowstorm from impossible range, had turned certain death into miraculous survival with nothing but skill, courage, and perfect timing.